Somewhere, right now, someone is drowning in a problem they could easily fix, simply refusing to ask for the help, sitting one phone call away, calling it independence. Somewhere else, someone is standing quietly behind a piece of work they did with real care, needing nobody's applause to know, privately and completely, that it was done right. Both of these people would say the same word if asked what they're feeling. They are nowhere close to feeling the same thing. Pride is one of the few words in the language that points in two almost opposite directions at once, and most people never learn to tell which version is actually operating in a given moment. There is pride as earned dignity, the quiet, settled satisfaction of having done something with genuine care, integrity, and effort. And there is pride as ego defense, a fragile, brittle need to protect a self-image from any threat, however small, however true. These two things share a name and almost nothing else. One builds a person steadily over an entire lifetime. The other, left unexamined, quietly isolates and eventually diminishes them. This episode exists to help tell them apart. The healthy version of pride is built the same way everything else discussed throughout this series is built, through sustained, genuine effort, consistent integrity, and work done well, regardless of whether anyone is watching. Picture someone who has spent years mastering a craft, raising a family with real care, or simply showing up honestly and reliably in their responsibilities. The quiet satisfaction this person feels, privately, needs no external validation to be real. It doesn't require anyone else's applause, and it doesn't shrink in the absence of it. This form of pride is stable precisely because it's built on something real and internally verified, a person's own honest knowledge of what they actually did and how they actually did it. The other version of pride operates on an entirely different mechanism, not the confirmation of genuine accomplishment, but the protection of a self-image that feels, underneath, uncertain or fragile. Picture someone who reacts with disproportionate defensiveness to even mild, constructive criticism, not because the criticism is unfair, but because any suggestion of imperfection threatens a self-image that was never actually built on solid, verified ground in the first place. This kind of pride isn't really about the specific thing being defended. It's about protecting an underlying uncertainty from ever being exposed. This version tends to be loud, brittle, and easily wounded, the opposite of the quiet stability that characterizes genuinely earned pride. One of the clearest signs distinguishing these two versions is how a person responds to needing help. Picture someone struggling with a real problem, financial, emotional, practical, who refuses offered help, insisting they can handle it alone, even as the situation continues to deteriorate. This refusal often gets framed, by the person doing it, as strength or independence. Examined honestly, it's frequently something closer to fear, the fear that accepting help would be an admission of inadequacy that the fragile version of their pride simply cannot tolerate. Genuinely earned pride has no trouble accepting help when it's genuinely needed, because a person's underlying worth was never actually dependent on never needing anyone in the first place. Perhaps no behavior more clearly separates these two versions than how a person handles being wrong. Picture someone who, faced with clear evidence of a mistake, still refuses to acknowledge it directly, offering a technically worded non-apology, shifting blame subtly, or simply changing the subject rather than saying, plainly, "I was wrong, and I'm sorry." This resistance rarely comes from genuine confidence. It comes from a fragile self-image that experiences the simple admission of error as an unbearable threat. A person with genuinely earned pride can say, "I was wrong," without it costing them anything real, because their sense of worth was never actually built on the pretense of never being wrong in the first place. It's worth being precise here. Genuinely earned pride and real humility are not actually opposites, despite how they're often framed. False pride and humility are opposites. True pride and humility can, and often do, coexist in the same person. Picture someone who has achieved genuine mastery in a field, who feels a quiet, settled confidence in their ability, and who is simultaneously the first to acknowledge the limits of that ability, the people who help them get there, and the areas where they still have room to grow. This is not a contradiction. It's what mature, earned pride actually looks like when it isn't being confused with ego. Fragile pride, by contrast, cannot coexist with genuine humility at all, because it requires constant defense of an image that has no room for acknowledged limitation. Left unexamined over enough years, fragile pride tends to produce a very specific, very lonely outcome. A person surrounded by fewer and fewer people willing to be honest with them. Picture someone whose defensive reaction to any criticism, no matter how gently offered, has trained everyone around them to simply stop offering it. Over time, this person finds themselves increasingly isolated from honest feedback, not because people stopped caring, but because the cost of honesty with them became too high to keep paying. This isolation compounds over years, often without the person at the center of it ever understanding why the people around them seem increasingly guarded, careful, and distant. Within close relationships specifically, fragile pride tends to produce a particular, corrosive pattern, an inability to be the one who admits fault first, even when both people privately know exactly who was actually wrong. Picture a couple in a recurring disagreement, where both people know, on some level, who bears more responsibility for a specific conflict, and yet neither will be the one to say so first, each waiting for the other to concede, each protecting a fragile pride that treats admitting fault as a kind of defeat. Relationships can survive a great deal of disagreement. What they struggle to survive is this specific pattern repeated over years. Two people more committed to protecting their own image than to actually resolving what's between them. There's a useful distinction worth naming directly, because these two qualities are frequently confused. Confidence is a stable, internal sense of one's own capability, while fragile pride is a defensive posture built around protecting an image from any threat. Picture two people entering the same difficult negotiation. One is genuinely confident, secure enough in their position to genuinely listen to the other side, willing to adjust if a better argument appears. The other, driven by fragile pride, treats any concession as a personal loss, unable to hear the other side clearly because too much energy is spent protecting their own position from any appearance of weakness. Confidence can bend without breaking. Fragile pride experiences bending as breaking, which is precisely why it holds rigid positions long after they've stopped serving anyone. One of the most costly effects of fragile pride is specifically practical. It tends to block exactly the kind of honest feedback a person needs most in order to actually improve. Picture someone whose visible defensiveness has trained colleagues, friends, or family to soften every piece of feedback until it's nearly useless, or to withhold it entirely. This person may genuinely want to improve, and yet has, through their own reaction to past feedback, cut themselves off from the very information that improvement requires. Pride, in this specific sense, doesn't just cost relationships. It quietly caps a person's own growth by making the truth too expensive for anyone around them to keep offering. There's a specific, sophisticated disguise fragile pride often wears, framing itself as high standards, refusing to do something beneath them, or declining to engage with people or tasks they've decided are unworthy of their time. Picture someone who refuses to take an available, honest job because it feels beneath their sense of themselves, even while genuinely needing the income. Or someone who won't apologize first in a conflict because that's not who I am, as though the refusal itself were a point of integrity, rather than what it usually is. Fragile pride wearing the language of principle. Genuine standards are usually about the quality of one's own conduct. Fragile pride disguised as standards is usually about protecting a self-image from anything that might threaten it, dressed up to sound more virtuous than it actually is. To be clear, this episode is not arguing against pride in one's own work. Quite the opposite. Genuine pride in doing something well is one of the most durable, healthy motivators available to anyone. Picture someone who takes real, quiet satisfaction in doing a task thoroughly and well, regardless of whether anyone will notice the difference between that and a rushed, mediocre version. This satisfaction, rooted in a real internal standard rather than external comparison or ego protection, tends to sustain effort and quality far more reliably than either external praise or fear of criticism ever could on their own. This is the version of pride worth actively cultivating, not the fragile kind that needs constant defending, but the quiet kind that simply knows, internally and honestly, when something has been done right. A common fear keeps people attached to fragile pride longer than serves them. The worry that releasing it means becoming a pushover or losing all sense of self-respect in the process. Picture someone practicing the specific behaviors discussed throughout this episode. Asking for help when genuinely needed, apologizing plainly when actually wrong, accepting feedback without immediate defensiveness. None of this requires becoming a doormat or abandoning genuine standards. It simply requires separating genuine dignity, which remains fully intact, from the fragile ego protection that was never actually dignity in the first place, however similar the two can look from the outside. Real dignity, it turns out, survives admitting a mistake completely intact. It was fragile pride that couldn't survive it, which says something important about which one was ever actually load-bearing. Underneath most fragile pride sits a specific, rarely admitted fear that asking for help, admitting fault, or accepting correction will be seen by others as weakness, and that this perceived weakness will cost something significant: respect, status, love. Picture this fear tested directly. Someone who finally admits a mistake plainly or accepts help they've long refused, discovering, often to their surprise, that the people around them respond not with the anticipated judgment, but with increased warmth and respect. This happens more often than fragile pride predicts, because, as discussed in an earlier episode of this series, genuine strength and the willingness to be honest about limitation are rarely actually in conflict. It's fragile pride that insists they are. Like everything else explored throughout this series, learning to tell these two versions of pride apart and choosing the one worth building is never accomplished in a single decisive moment. It's built the same quiet way discipline, patience, and every other quality discussed in this series are built, through small, repeated choices that rarely feel significant on their own. The help accepted instead of refused out of fear. The apology given plainly, without a defensive qualifier attached. The feedback received without an immediate need to explain it away. The quiet satisfaction taken in work done well, needing no audience to confirm it. None of it announces itself as character building while it's happening, but it accumulates, quietly, into someone whose pride, when it shows up, is the kind that actually holds weight. Settled, earned, unafraid of being questioned, because it was never built on anything that couldn't survive the question in the first place. That is the pride that builds, and the pride that buries. Not two different feelings, but the same word, describing two entirely different foundations underneath it. If this reached you today, share it with someone who needs the reminder.